Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you today. I am Joe Schwieterman. I'm professor at DePaul University in Chicago and director of the school's Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development. We do urban planning and transportation. And DePaul is the largest Catholic university in the country. We're about a mile and a half from here, from our Loop campus, and we take pride in the fact we're one of the only schools in the country, maybe the only one, we have to ride the L to go between our two main campuses, the rapid transit. So we're really built around transit and have an urban mission that we really we take seriously. So I'm really honored to be presenting this panel today. As I said to the group, it would have been hard to do this 2-3 months ago because we were still in the fog of the pandemic, and now things are opening up. Just in the last few weeks, we've had some magnificent weather here in Chicago. Got a little cool just for this conference, I see, but you can feel the dynamics of our central area start to come back, especially up here on North Michigan Avenue. And so it'll be really fascinating today to hear from our 4 panelists about some of the work they're doing. And it's a great opportunity for me to catch up a little bit on how things have unfolded in the last few months. So our panel today is Krishnamurthy, who is Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Project Development Division of Chicago Department of Transportation. And the city, as you know, has a really diverse and fast-moving agenda on all modes of transit. So it's going to be great to talk to Vig about some of the things he's excited about post-pandemic. Benet Haller, we've also known for many years. He's Transit Manager at Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways. And Cook County, I can say, after being partially on the sidelines for many years in the last decade, has really come forward to be a mover and a shaker in making our transit system more modern, more integrated, with lots of fascinating experiments and pilot programs they're working with. So it'll be great to hear what Benet has to say. Erin, who's Executive Director at Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, which is our regional land use agency, and she has a staff of over 100 that she manages at CMAP. And CMAP 2 is really thought of as a dynamic organization. They recently moved into the old post office, into new space. And I think Erin's timing of her remarks are great too, because of some of the exciting developments with the Biden infrastructure bill that either make your job really fun or really difficult. I'm not sure which that is, but it's certainly going to be good to hear her remarks. And Jessica Hector-hsu, who's Director of Planning and Market Development at the Regional Transportation Authority of Illinois. And the RTA, as you know, oversees our 3 major transit agencies in metropolitan Chicago: the Chicago Transit Authority, Metro, our commuter rail operator, and Pace Suburban Bus. And so there's a lot of fascinating research you're doing on what life is going to be like post-pandemic in the transit world. So we're going to have lots of questions. Try to keep your questions concise so we can have a really good back and forth. And what we're going to do is ask our panelists to come up in the order on the screen to present one slide about either a big idea or a thought they have, just to sort of prime the pump on our discussions today. So Vig, do you want to grab the... Great. So I can advance.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome all for those who are from out of town to Chicago. And as Joe said, I'm Deputy Commissioner at Chicago Department of Transportation for the Division of Project Development. And that very quickly entails really our streets, all modes, walking, biking, rolling, busing, scooting, as of recently, and driving too, and looking at it from the perspective of safety, accessibility, mobility, equity, all the itties of our times, and integrating that into the physical space between our private and our public. The kind of provocative question I have for today, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues, is what peak are we planning for? And what I mean by that is, when we say peak in this profession, I think probably most people think peak demand. And with the pandemic, we all spent a lot of time wrestling with the word essential, and what is essential, and essential services, and so on. And the way we interpret that, or the way I interpret that, is well, what are our values, right? What is essential is defined by what your values are. And so, in terms of peak, we've always been focused on peak demand. But what are the peak values? How do we use our street to generate the most value? And is that moving the maximum number of people at that 5 p.m.? Maybe, maybe not. And I think we'll talk today a lot about those other things that have really come to the forefront in the last 2 years, like that have been a latent value, the desire to dine outside, the desire to be connected to our community, the desire to have places to walk, bike, recreate, be connected to your neighborhood. That those are some of the peak values, actually, that we can get out of our streets and balance that with the mobility need as well. And so I look forward to the rest of this afternoon. Thank you.
Great, and we will go next to Benet.
I assume this is working. I usually don't use amplification for my voice. If you all know me, you know why, but I will try to keep my voice a little low. So Cook County, in case you didn't realize, there were some recent rulings that have really changed our role, and they have to do with essentially the Illinois Road Builders Association suing the state and saying how wrong it is for the county to use MFT dollars to subsidize courts and the sheriff and other things like that. And essentially the Illinois Supreme Court has said, yes, road builders, you are right each time. And what that means is that my department has money that it must spend either on mine and other people's salaries in our department, or for actual transportation projects. And so that means that we do have a lot more money. And the other challenge is where the Cook County owns and maintain roads. For a lot of you, you may never ride on a county road if you stay, or I'll add a little bit to that in a second. But the roads we own and maintain are peripheral in many cases to the core parts of the city, particularly Chicago itself. We technically do own Western, and in fact, we own all of the expressways in the city of Chicago. However, for about 100 years, we've deferred to a different agency to actually maintain that infrastructure, that being CDOT. So if we are trying to improve transit, we have to find ways to spend our dollars on something other than the handful of roads like Old Orchard and Oakton, where buses and transit might actually exist, but we have to spend money across the city broadly, across the county broadly, to try to make sure that we are supporting transit. We are also working on a bike plan at the present time, as well as a transit plan. And I think the key message I want to throw out there, and the provocative question is, how can we make sure that particularly bike and transit services are complementary and not in conflict? That, for me, is a very crucial issue, and particularly acknowledging that major arterial streets are highly contested spaces, and perhaps particularly for cyclists, there are a myriad of alternate streets that they might use.
Erin, do you want to go next?
Happy to. Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm sandwiched between the city and the county. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Northeastern Illinois. So we cover 7 counties, 284 municipalities. There are about 8.5 million residents in our region. So when I say region, and Jessica has a very similar region here, but when I think about what we need to be focused on is all of the communities in our region and how we think about broadening access to mobility options. One of the things that we did when the pandemic started was really start to think about, well, what does this mean for land use patterns and housing and how people are going to use transportation in different ways, because there will be ripple effects if people don't go back to a transit system that in the ways that they were going to previously. And I think we didn't have our arms around what work from home was going to be like and what policies businesses were going to put in place. But we wanted to start to articulate some scenarios around that, and then think about how do you operationalize some of the things that people really enjoyed about working from home. I know for many people it was not a good experience, but for some communities they saw upticks in people going down to their main street to buy a cup of coffee, or looking for lunch in the middle of the day once things sort of opened up a little bit, biking with their families, and making sure that we have that safe infrastructure embedded in the town centers across our region. And I think it's something as a planner, my background is urban planning, that we've been talking about. How do you help support main streets for a very long time? But there just wasn't the impetus or the economic development realities or pressures to sort of revitalize main streets in traditional ways that they had existed previously. So we've been thinking about safe streets. We've been thinking about how we can help support our communities, implement and take advantage of the infrastructure bill dollars that exist. And then, how do we work to make sure that we are valuing transit as a true asset to community development, redevelopment, and making sure that, it's not just about how many people you can pack on a train to make it efficient, but the fact that we have hospitals that work, world-class hospital systems, that we have, other world-class businesses, manufacturing industries across our region that are successful to our regional economy. So those are some of the big picture things that we've been focused on. And again, really it's about, from Chicago all the way out to McHenry County or Will counties, that we're thinking about the diverse array of communities and making them better places for people of all abilities.
Well, thank you. And Jessica, do you want to go next?
Sure. So, hi everybody. I'm Jessica Hector-hsu. I'm the Director of Planning and Market Development at the RTA, as Joe aptly described. And we are the planning and funding agency for the 3 transit operators. And so the big question that I'm asking right now is, who's going to pay for transit? Who should pay for transit? It's really a challenging time in the life of transit. I know you all know this, and we've been talking about it throughout the pandemic. But historically, the way that the transit system is funded, there's an expectation built into it that transit needs to prove its worth through the number of people who ride it and the fares that they pay. And here in Illinois, we have in this area, we have what we call a 50% recovery ratio, which means that half the cost of operating the system needs to come from those people who ride and the fares that they pay. And what happened during the pandemic is that not as many people are riding, and we're having a conversation about the fares that people pay and whether it's affordable for people to ride. And so what's happened is that very delicate balance that was created is now being questioned. And I think it's good for us to ask those questions. I think it's timely to ask that question. And I think we're going to have some really interesting conversations over the next few months as a part of our strategic planning process. We'll talk more about throughout our talk here today. But that's the big question I'm asking, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation together.
Excellent. Those are really nice setup here. So before we get into our Q&A, just so we can learn a little bit about our audience today, this is a national conference. Who is from the primary homes outside of the Chicago region, just to get a sense of that? Who is somewhat of a regular bicyclist? Every week or so you're on a bike. All right, so that's a good setup to our first question. We're going to start micro and look at streets, and then we're going to gradually expand to more regional planning type topics. I want to start with complete streets and the biggest barriers to accommodating pedestrians and motor cars and scooters and so forth. And I just read this morning the number of traffic fatalities nationwide is up again. What have you learned that maybe isn't been previously reported or commonly known about this effort to make streets more multi-purposed? We'll let Erin and Big answer that one.
All right. Well, I think, again, like every part of the region, we are seeing increased fatalities, and it's due to largely 2 things. Increased speeds, as there were less people on the roads. It was easy for people to be a little bit more, I'll say, reckless in terms of following the laws that are in place regarding speeds. But also the increase in people biking and walking. We're seeing a lot of pedestrians and bicyclist fatality increases across our region. And I think, as we think about what our role is, we will be getting additional resources from the federal government through the infrastructure bill to implement complete streets approaches. But one of the things that I found most interesting about the data that we have at CMAP is that, when I say increased speeds and I say fatalities, what was the image that was in your mind?
Car hitting a bike.
A car hitting a bike. Maybe a car hitting a pedestrian. Yeah. Well, and I think, too, oftentimes we think about sort of those high-capacity facilities that we have, like expressways, right? That's where you see those fiery crashes. And many of the crashes and the fatalities that we have are on streets with a posted limit of, I think, between 25 and 35 miles per hour. right? So they're not happening on our major high-speed, high-capacity expressways. They're really happening on local streets where there are schools, where there are people, where there are houses, pedestrians, right? But I think we've also realized too that we all know when you live in your community, you don't necessarily, you know where the dangerous intersections are, right? And so you don't cross those intersections or you stay away from them. So if they're happening at places that aren't even the most dangerous places to cross a street, that means that we need to think differently about some of the tools and the measures that we use, whether it's reducing speed limits, whether it's thinking about automated resources to be able to tackle some of these problems if it's done in a way that reduces bias for communities is, I think, the key as we think about implementing automated strategies. But those are, I think, some of the big picture things we're seeing in our region. It's not different from any other region. So this complete safer streets framework that we need to be thinking about here, this whole systems approach to safety is going to be critical into the future.
Vic, do you want to comment a little bit about some of the successes you've had or innovations that you're trying to do with streets?
Yeah, sure, Joe. I mean, I think Erin framed it really well that, like, this is a national concern. This is one of the top concerns of Chicago DOT and my division. And the systematic nature of the problem and therefore the systematic nature of the solution. And so the thing that's really been interesting in Chicago is we have something called Chicago Works, which is a new local infrastructure bond program. There's been a lot of talk about federal infrastructure money, and we have a state infrastructure program. But the power of local money, $20 million a year specifically allocated towards Vision Zero and complete streets in Chicago on an annual basis, has allowed us to scale in ways that we've never been able to scale before and quick. Planning, design, and delivery within a single season. So we have for example, in the south side of Chicago in Washington Park, one of the community areas that is experiencing historically elevated levels of crashes, able to do a community process which starts with really understanding the problem, walking, all those things that Erin said, like figuring out those intersections on the way to school, on the way to church, but then coming right in with resources and delivering those rapid delivery projects. We've done 400 pedestrian improvements in the last year. We've done the biggest number of bike lanes ever last year, increased our number of protected bike lanes on an annual basis by 250% last year compared to the 10-year average. And so we are just able to deliver at scale through having that dedicated resource that's local, so we can use local knowledge and local money and make local improvements. I think that is where the transformation happens, because these issues of speed and safety, they're all really big, and they are big in that, NHTSA released their 2021 numbers yesterday for motor vehicle or all fatalities on our roadways, and it's terrible. It's a terrible number, but it's also really daunting when you see 42,000. Where do you start? And so this community-based work is sort of the way to get there and really connect with making this big abstract thing very, very tangible, and really good results in terms of people who are invested, people who see the benefit and stake. This is my street and my community, and we do want these kinds of modernizations, and we're very glad that we can deliver them, bigger and faster than ever.
Can I just say, to add some color commentary to that Chicago, with being a grid laid out city, that our city government has really been, I think, clever and innovative in being able to experiment with things that don't cause massive public backlash about congestion and things like that, because the nature of our grid allows us to have alternative routes for roads. So taking a lane away here or there, there's been some pushback, but it certainly hasn't stopped the program. We're going to pivot to another topic, but it relates a bit what we said, and it's about how we better integrate all these transportation options, from bicycling with our Divvy bike sharing system to our transit network to rideshare, all kind of things. And I'm a good example of that. I came in today with my paper 10-ride Metro ticket to come up here. I bought my one-day CTA pass. If I take a Divvy, I use another payment method to get back. And the pandemic has sort of raised a lot of questions. Like, look, these silos might have worked 5 years ago. Now people just want to get from point A to point B, and that car is more attractive than it was before. Benet, your department's doing a lot of interesting work to try to harmonize transit options or to build bridges. And Jessica, you can comment on that too. And this has been a very politically touchy topic in our region. But what about integration do you think we can expect to see in the next few years?
Well, it's certainly right this time. Oh, there we go. Oh, look at that. So, as I said, we have more financial resources, and we realize that if we really are trying to benefit all the residents and visitors to the county, we need to be spending our money on a regional scale. And we initially did some studies, particularly in South Cook, which we recognize as an area where they have some of the worst work commutes in the region because of the jobs mismatch, that there aren't a lot of jobs anymore south of Chicago, particularly in Cook County, and there are a lot of jobs up by O'Hare. And in fact, over my lifetime, the centroid of jobs in the metro area has been gradually marching pretty much northwest from slightly west of downtown Chicago to now south of O'Hare because of all the growth of jobs around O'Hare and the loss of jobs in the southern part of Cook and for that matter in Lake County, Indiana. So one of the things we did in that study is we did some stops modeling using a consultancy who has some members here to look at the impact of lowering fares and on Metra, and also creating some kind of transfer between CTA and Metra, where essentially you would not be paying the full CTA fare having completed your Metra ride, but would pay just say a quarter or nothing transferring to CTA, and then vice versa, that in the end you would only pay like the Metra fare as your fare, and you would essentially be able to ride for free beyond that as part of a trip. This is very similar to what Seattle has done, so we're looking at other communities. That seemed like a really fruitful area, and essentially we have said to the transit agencies and to RTA that we are keen to use our financial resources to work toward this goal. However, we definitely recognize fare box recovery issues, notwithstanding that if we talk about fare integration, we also have to talk about what the fares will be in that conversation so that CTA, Metra, and PACE know the financial implications, how the back office moving of funds will work and everything else. But our key concern is we want ultimately the user experience to be seamless, that card will work when you go to a metro station. It'll work on a PACE bus. It'll work on all the CTA facilities, and you're not going to get gouged for using one or the other. We right now have a pilot you hopefully have heard of, Fair Transit South Cook, in which we are essentially discounting rides on both the Metro Electric and the Rock Island throughout the county, essentially to the current sort of lower fare, reduced fare, which is more or less half of the fare you'd otherwise pay. We are about a year and a half into this 3-year pilot. It will end at December of 2023. So far, because we implemented it during the pandemic, I can't say that the overall ridership growth has been robust, which isn't very surprising. However, it has led some people to take Metra more than they would have before. It's definitely reduced their overall cost, and certainly we would think going forward that we will continue to push to figure out ways that we can get the agencies to collectively work together to create fare integration, because then also that makes certain other investments more sensible. For example, better connections between CTA bus and Metro train stations. That becomes more of a thing if people are actually doing it on a regular basis because of the discounted fare. So we do think, given the fact that Chicago metropolitan area historically is either the best or second best transit network in the country, we want to build on that asset, and we think just giving it up and saying, oh, pandemic, everyone's going to drive now, just forget about it. Like, that's not a good position for us given our locational advantages, and particularly Cook County, because as you guys probably know, 2/3 of all metro stations are in Cook County, all the CTA stations are in Cook County, all the CTA bus lines run in Cook County. So we are the center of this transit network.
Jessica, can you comment on that, or about sort of the bigger questions about paying for transit, that this certainly complements the same debate?
Yeah, sure. So, fare integration is a journey, I'd say. It's not a destination, and not to be punny, but it really is a journey. And the fare integration has been a part of the regional conversation for as long as RTA has existed. So in the 70s and 80s, when the private operators were turn into public entities, there was a conversation about fair integration that had to happen to create those entities. And as that conversation has evolved over the years, it eventually morphed into the Ventra system that we have today that does allow for some literal payment integration and an app that you can use. I used my Ventra app to, an Apple Pay to get on the CTA bus to get here and on my Metro ride this morning. And so we've been on that journey. And I think that as we talk about fair integration, we have to think about that balance I mentioned and the idea of transit proving its worth through the number of people who ride and the fares that they pay. And when you start talking about fair integration, what happens is the fares that they pay becomes a part of the conversation that the agencies need to have about what, if you take some of that money away because people pay less, how do they pay to make up the difference? Who pays? And the beauty of what Cook County did is they came forward and they said, we'll pay. So if you try fair integration, we'll pay for it. And it's working. It is testing that model. And I'm hopeful that Cook County's example will be something that we'll be able to point to and say, okay, how do we advance that conversation? How do we take it a step further and say, okay, if we want more fair integration, who's going to pay? And how do we get our community partners, our county partners, our business partners to help pay for that and to see if we can together advance that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great answer, and how the pandemic has opened the door for these kind of discussions about external funders to experiment and so forth. And which leads me to my next question. What I really like coming to this conference is just the exposure you get to private sector innovators, people doing scooters and apps and 1,000 different innovations. Sure enough, I wasn't in here 15 minutes and I was chatting with somebody about a new app that's revolutionary in some ways about common payment. But when you guys, we'll start with you, Erin, where do you see the private sector playing a role in facilitating these transit and mobility innovations that can make our life better?
That's a good question. I think I have a mixed response to that question. I think it's important to have sort of the technology companies spurring these ideas and pushing us to think beyond what it is that we typically think about. But I think it's also really important that we, as CMAP and a government agency, are thinking about the diverse array of capacities of our communities to be able to take on that technology, whether it's 5G, when all of these little cell phone tower things and tracking technology devices that were going to solve all of our problems and give us the data that we needed. We had communities that had lots of people coming to their doors saying like, hey, can we put this up? We'll give you some money. And what am I getting in exchange, or what am I thinking about? So I know Chicago's thought a lot about sort of the technology and the data and how those things can work together to their benefit. But I think really making sure that public-private partnership is beneficial to both sides, the public and the private sector, and that we're thinking about sort of a measured approach to making sure that the market isn't driving the existing inequities to become even worse than we were today. I was at a City Club talk where President Preckwinkle, who's the chair of Cook County, it was showing a map of where low-income households are and where there are environmental problems and where the schools are poor. And she had it right. The map looks exactly the same for all of those things, right? And so how can we as public sector agencies get out ahead of that to make sure that map looks more equitable as we think about adopting technologies and thinking about cellular technology availability in communities, Wi-Fi, right? It needs to be strong enough for communities to take advantage of. I don't think about my monthly cell phone bill, but there are lots of people who they are done with their minutes. When you're done with your minutes, well, how can you access your transit card if it's on your phone? So I think, again, it's those types of questions that public sector agencies need to be thinking about as we work with private sector partners. But not to say that there isn't a huge role of bringing that innovation, and I know that there's enough brain power to solve these problems. So the eternal optimist in me will say that there's a way to do it right.
Yeah, that's a really, really good perspective. And I know I've been around Chicago long enough to know there's certain topics that just make people crazy, you might say. And maybe
Third rail issues, maybe?
and one was the city arranged a deal to privatize our parking meters, about 15 years ago? And that created this backlash against private contracting that's literally taken us almost a generation to work our way out of, because it was a deal that had some clauses in it that shouldn't have been allowed that tied the city's hands in some ways. So Vig, you came in way after that, so we're not implicating you, but when the city credit the city for just innovation with e-scooters, of course, with Divvy, working with citywide presence of that. You seem to have gotten really adept at leveraging some of these technologies in ways that are maybe more equitable than what we saw 5 or 6 years ago when Divvy was first rolled out. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. Well, and I appreciate the shout out there. I mean, actually, some of the members of the team here have worked on that are in the audience. So thank you, first of all, to the team. And it's been a growth, right? With the bike share system, as you mentioned, we started smaller, central area, proof of concept, and now, from 100 to beyond 800, from a few bikes to beyond 16,000 bikes. I think the key is what I alluded to earlier, shared values. And so with the scooter pilots that were piloted 2 times, it was very clear that, if you're going to do business in the city, it's not just do no harm. We have to create benefits. And so there are very clear targets for geographic distribution of fleet that, can now all just be put in the area where we know, as Erin said, the market's going to go. That's not the point, right? We're trying to actually create access. Then you have to have zonal targets, distributional targets. Those learnings from the pilots were put into the terms for the permanent program, which is going to soon come to Chicago, to have geographic distribution, transparency around pricing. Really ask in this idea that of public and partner, you bring, it's a table, but bring to us your best. And so through the licensing process, we really challenge the private sector, like what can you bring technology-wise, programs-wise, incentives, all those wraparound services that it's not just a scooter, it is everything about getting people onto micromobility. And I think that's been part of the success, is really codifying and putting into the foundation of those programs those values.
And it has been impressive to watch the learning with that, with the priority areas for scooters and citywide for Divvy, which is our bike share system, which, taking some political knocks, you might say, at public hearings and so forth to get it done. And it's really, I think, our city stands out in that respect. And curious, later we can talk about how this summer's scooter pilot's going, but I hear it's going quite well. Word on the street. We're now going to step back and go fairly broad. And as I mentioned, we're now out of the worst of the pandemic enough that we can start thinking analytically about the strategic direction of transit in our region. And the RTA has been doing some really deep dives into that, understanding what our options are. Benet, of course, this is a centerpiece of your work, and Erin and Vig, you have a lot to say about this too. So we'll start with you, Jessica. Do you want to comment a little bit about what you're learning from the strategic planning process and just how you're going about getting feedback?
Yeah, sure. So part of one of the wonderful things about my job is that I get to work with the service boards and our communities to develop a strategic plan for transit every 5 years. And we developed one a few years ago. Actually, Vig was part of that team in his previous life that focused on capital, because at the time, capital investment was really the thing that we were focusing on. Fast forward 5 years, we've had a pandemic. We have 2 fantastic capital bills, one coming out of the state, one coming out of the federal government. And so right now we're facing a new question about who pays for transit and what should our strategic direction be going forward. We have decided to use a very different process this time than previous times, in that we are inviting a lot more people to participate in that. So how many of you ride transit regularly? Okay. How many of you have ever commented, if you're honest with yourself, on your transit agency's strategic planning process? Okay. Well, we got some planners here. That's good. I'm glad to see that. I venture to guess if I asked that question in another room, there'd be many fewer hands, okay? We don't get a lot of people who are weighing in on strategic planning processes, if we're honest. And it's not for lack of want. It's not because we're not trying. It's just that there isn't a lot of interest from the public about those topics. So we've worked really hard to invite many people into the conversation this time. We spent last fall from November through February going out and talking to people. We had a survey out, we went to events, we had a panel discussion, and we had about 1,500 people comment on that. We get a lot of comments, I should add. When we do a survey about transit service, we get a lot. We'll get 15, 20, 30,000 because that's a different kind of survey. What I'm talking about is strategic planning specifically, which is a bit different. So we had about 1,500 people who weighed in. They told us a lot of things. They said that equity is really important. They said change is really important. We need to commit to change. They said that we needed to think about safety. We needed to think about the rider experience, that we needed to think about a whole bunch of things that involve RTA, that involve our transit agencies, that involve our partners at the table here. And we have used that to develop a new vision for the plan and to think about the outcomes that we want to see out of the plan. And we have now convened a set of working groups that involve about 100 other people from 60 agencies who are meeting with us every 2 weeks to talk about goals for the plan. And it's a lot of people. I see some of our partners here. Robert's one of the on one of those groups, if you don't mind me calling you out. We've asked them to spend time with us and to really share their thoughts, to just come as who they are and who they represent. Some of them work for entities, some of them are just riders, some of them are both. And we asked them to come fully and to participate in that process and help us stay grounded in the reality of a transit rider experience that represents our very broad and diverse region, but also push us to think strategically about where we want to go together in the hopes that we can work together to think differently about transit, think differently about that funding balance, and to help answer the question, who's going to pay for transit going forward? Because it's a different time, it's a different place, and we need to really work hard to think through that together. So we've embarked on this process. We continue to hear a lot about, we hear about fare integration, we're hearing about funding, we're hearing about rider experience, and I don't want to get out ahead of the group, so sign up for our mailing list and follow that process as we go forward, but it should be really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Benet, you want to add comments? I know you've done some bike planning as well, and just what you're learning.
Sure. Well, I mean, as I guess the one thing I said right up front is I'm very interested in making sure that bike infrastructure is complementary and not competitive with particularly bus infrastructure. And as I think within the transit plan itself, a major observation is, this isn't news to anyone on this table, but, we need to make our buses work better and move faster, have their own exclusive facilities, signal preemption, all those things, better ways that people are paying their fares so a person paying in change is not like making the whole bus stop and wait. And that's true both for CTA within Chicago, but then also specifically thinking about PACE doing new express routes on some of the other expressways beyond just the Stevenson. They now have signs on the Edens Expressway, but I've not yet seen a bus in that very narrow bus lane on the side there. But I think particularly thinking about certain key bus corridors like 79th Street or Chicago Avenue and Ashland BRT, let me just be clear, I worked for the city planning department when that was really being pushed hard, and I took my lumps for Ashland BRT, and I'm proud of that, and I continue to think making sure that we take certain corridors and make them as bus friendly and really bus and pedestrian friendly as possible, and then think more about how cyclists are able to cross those streets and get onto a parallel route as opposed to necessarily being in that same route. Because yes, I know some people talk about this truism that, oh, your typical urban bus and your cyclist, they go at the same speed. Okay, but that doesn't mean you should put them in the way of each other.
That's right. Erin, do you want to comment on more of the regional planning aspects that you're working with?
Sure. I think I'm talking about transit. Everyone's sort of talking about multi-mobility options for folks, because one of the things that we quantified as we were looking at what the impacts are if people don't return to transit is that if 25% of the people in our region chose not to take transit on a weekday to work, we would experience 193,000 hours of additional congestion in our region, which is about $1.2 billion of lost productivity. Now that assumes that everybody went back to work 5 days a week, but I think what we are seeing and what regions across the country are seeing is that every hour of the day, traffic is up, except for that very first hour of the day. I guess we like to sleep in as humans. But congestion is worse. It's unpredictable throughout the day, and that's bad for people. It's also really bad for goods movement. And in a region like Chicago, where freight and logistics is one of our top industries, it really impedes our ability to get the goods to the places across the country that it needs to go. A third of all freight across our country comes through our region here. And so those are sort of the lingering side effects of what happens if we don't have a stable, predictable transit system and a stable, predictable sort of commute patterns for people and goods. It really impacts and impedes our economy from future growth. And so as I think about what we need to be doing, it's not just sort of downtown Chicago, it's our big centers across the region. It's about all of the health and life sciences industries that have been growing here, the metals manufacturing, that's one of our strengths here, the food and beverage industries that are here. If they can't get their goods to the places that they need to go, and if they can't get employees to those places, we are going to continue to lose out on continued growth in our region.
We'll go to our last question, our last major question, then we'll do some wrap up. But Jessica, your question was who's going to pay for transit? And that's more than a rhetorical question, I understand, because we do have a cliff that's going to be coming up before too long. Erin, you mentioned that you're in the middle of some exciting grant prospects. Cook County, it's good to see that you're flush, at least for the moment, maybe with cash, but things could be different tomorrow. And the city of Chicago, of course.
Fuel tax, gas.
Thank
you.
Fill up those semis in Chicago, and and Vig, of course, the city has been a beneficiary, I think, of a quicker rebound than many thought, as well as federal stimulus funding. So give us a sense of the landscape on who is going to pay and what's happening now that's relevant to understanding that question. We'll start with transit for you, Jessica, since this is a big part of your life, I understand.
Yeah, sure. So nobody's asked me who's paying for transit right now. So I'll answer that question. Right now, not as many people are riding. So there is a funding deficit, and that funding deficit's being filled with federal relief dollars. So the 3 federal bills that were passed in 2020, those in early 2021, those have been essentially filling that funding gap, which has been great. It's kept New York running. It's kept us running. A lot of systems around the country have relied upon that. When that money runs out, that's when we need to have a new answer to the question. Because once that money is gone, if not as many people are riding, as Erin is talking about, and as they're seeing as the MPO, lives have changed, people are spending more time around home, and we're continuing to have a conversation about equity and fares, then that means we're going to have a funding deficit. So we are talking about that. It's not the only thing we're talking about as part of the strategic plan, but that's the big part of the conversation we're having. And I think in some ways our funding here has been pretty robust. We're funded partly by sales tax, and sales tax has actually done really well. During the very early months of the pandemic, it didn't, but in the later months of the pandemic, when everyone was up on Amazon, it did well. And last year, we actually the state extended sales tax to online sales, so that caused a bump in sales tax. So we're doing pretty well as far as regions go for funding transit in that respect. But again, we're going to have a pretty big budget gap that's going to be coming in the out years. So.
Yeah, like in 2 years, right? I mean, that's roughly the...
Yeah. I mean, it's a dynamic answer to the question because it depends on spending. It depends on a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, we would say within 2 to 5 years, we should see those funds run out among our 3 agencies.
Yeah, which makes these next 2 years with strategic planning really pivotal too.
Yes.
To sort of have something to something tangible to offer the public that shows that we're dynamically responding to post-pandemic life.
Right, exactly. And the RTA region is 6 counties. As Erin, the MPO is 7 counties, but we cover everything from the city of Chicago to McHenry County, so rural, urban, suburban, and everything in between. And everybody has different use patterns for transit. Everybody has different expectations for transit. The funding that Cook County and the city and the Collier counties pay is a little bit different as well. So when you start talking about needing more funding, we need to be able to have a conversation with all of those entities that are represented on the RTA board about what they're looking for from transit going forward and what they're willing to pay for transit going forward. And that will be a challenging conversation for sure.
Yes, indeed.
Exciting but challenging.
Excellent. Benet, you want to comment just about what's making possible some of the pilot programs you're doing and innovations? What sources?
Yeah, I mean, again, motor fuel tax, thank you for your support. That does pay for everything. But we certainly, one of the things we like to think about what our money can do that other money can't do. So we are not the federal government, and our money does not have the same strings attached to it as federal dollars do. So, for example, we can fund that initial feasibility study that allows an agency, whoever it may be, a municipality, a transit agency, to know if there's really a project there and to define it well enough that maybe they can get state or federal money. So our money can sort of be used to leverage those sorts of resources. We can just also absolutely pay for something. And that's, for example, the Fair Transit South Cook pilot is a $32 million commitment, $30 million to Metra, $2 million to PACE to subsidize the expansion of service on a bus that runs between the 95th Red Line station and the Chicago Heights bus center. So we have this money we can use in certain ways to make things happen. And the other thing we can do is we can, for like smaller infrastructure construction projects, we can just pay for that too. So, you know, not going through a federal process, which adds 3, 4, I mean, additional years are added. So those are great things. On the other hand, of course, we are also a partner, and so we are contributing, you know, some amount of money to some major projects, but we are not the primary funder for those. So particularly, I think first last mile pilots, you might have seen Curtis Vitek earlier talking about a Bedford Park first last mile project. That was a third funded by us, a third by RTA, a third by Bedford Park, and we sort of think that's perfect, right? We're all benefiting, we all got skin in the game, and we're testing this thing out. And I actually just heard that potentially that might become not a pilot, that Cintas may actually start to move to fund it, and the local businesses might actually fund the pilot, which of course is our ultimate objective, is we want those things to fly now that we put the seed funding in there. So I would say particularly that is an opportunity we are very keen to work with. And also it's notable that transit agencies who apply for money from us through our Invest and Cook program, they're aware of how to spend our money. And we, of course, like it when agencies realize, hey, we can use the money to do this, and that's unique to this pot of money, and that's the sort of thing we want to do, because it gives us, it really helps advance high-value projects with our investment up front.
Just point of clarification, mention the technology used for the pilot in Bedford Park, the kind of vehicles and things.
So that one kind of morphed thanks to that pandemic you all might have heard about, where originally it was going to be like a van, it's basically a free van shuttle, partly from the Orange Line station at Midway that would take people to businesses in Bedford Park, which is just a little south and west of the end of the Orange Line. Thanks to the pandemic, that became more of a ride share subsidy, so individual riders were able to, or workers who worked in Bedford Park were able to had access to the app. They were able to call and get a very low-cost ride-share service from a few locations: the Justice Metro Station, the Orange Line Station, I believe a facility near the old Chicago Fire Stadium, where you get a short service. Also, that allowed for a nighttime ride on Lyft all the way home at half rate. Those are the sorts of things we've used our money for. And again, I think part of it is because essentially we provide the money, we may, in some cases, are working with a private partner, and in some cases we're working with, and more often with a public agency. But I think it does allow us to look at a diversity of projects, and then also learning from those pilots, potentially think about other similar sorts of pilots we might implement in other parts of the county.
We just have a minute or so for both Erin and Vig to comment on this, and we'll wrap the panel up.
I think one of the things as we think about funding from the infrastructure bill, it's increasing a lot of the core formula programs that fund a lot of the infrastructure, traditional infrastructure that you see. But there's also really great new opportunities. Illinois will be getting about $50 million a year for electric vehicle infrastructure. But then there are all these competitive programs that we're seeing as well. So the big grant programs are out right now for mega projects that are hundreds of millions of dollars. But there's also going to be a lot of funding for small projects across communities, safe streets initiatives, complete streets, thinking about healthy streets. And so one of the things we've been trying to think about is how we can help prepare our communities for this influx of resources and get their projects off the ground so that when there are infrastructure dollars available, they're ready to hit the ground running. And so as the MPO, we're thinking about like a coordinated strategy for our lowest capacity communities to be able to be at the table and access and unlock those funds.
And Vic, you have the last word.
Thanks, Erin. Well, I mean, we certainly want to get our share of federal money and state money or beyond our share here in Chicago. But I think the punchline is we're not waiting. The Chicago Works program, as I mentioned, is over $1 billion program. And the thesis there really is it's not the funding, it's the value creation. So, we're putting our own money and our belief in these projects. We've started, 12 streetscape projects in traditionally economically disadvantaged areas on the south and west sides of Chicago. And the thesis is, those projects will pay for themselves in spades in terms of the value creation, the investment, the catalytic effect on safety and local economic development. And I think that's sort of why all of us are here, is that we believe that we can transform and make better through these investments. They pay their share beyond.
What a great discussion. It reminds us why we all, I think, really love our metropolitan area and how we're excited about how the leadership is making some things happen, which is bodes really well. I want to thank you all for being a great audience. We'll go ahead and wrap up the program. Let's give a big round of applause for our 4 expert speakers.